Imagine waking up one morning only to find that your family is being unjustly targeted. That's exactly what happened to a black diplomat and his children. On a seemingly ordinary day, they were suddenly confronted by local officers who began searching their belongings without cause. Confusion turned to outrage as the officers continued their actions, ignoring pleas and explanations. The children, innocent and scared, couldn't understand why they were being treated this way. The fear and humiliation hung heavily in the air. But the story doesn't end there. The following day, their father, an experienced diplomat, arrived. Seeing the injustice unfold, he demanded answers. And surprisingly, something changed. The officers, who had initially refused to listen, suddenly found themselves apologizing. What led to this unexpected turnaround? Why did they suddenly see the error of their ways? This isn't just a story of a single moment. It's a reflection of deeper issues and the fight for dignity and respect. Stay tuned to uncover the full story and discover the powerful lessons hidden beneath this shocking encounter. The incident left everyone shaken. The diplomat's family had never expected to face such treatment, especially in a place where they thought they were safe. They were accustomed to moving between different countries, navigating the complexities of diplomacy, but this moment felt deeply personal and unjust. The officers, seemingly indifferent to the rules, had acted on assumptions that painted an entirely different picture of who they were, an image shaped by prejudice and ignorance. As the diplomat pressed for answers, he couldn't shake the feeling that something more was at play. Was it mere coincidence, or had someone given the officers instructions? And why had the apology come so swiftly once he arrived? It didn't sit well with him. The kids, too young to fully grasp what had happened, could feel the tension in the air. Something was off, and they didn't like it. The community around them began to whisper, questions swirling about whether this was an isolated incident or part of a bigger pattern. Secrets seemed to lurk beneath the surface, and it became clear that this wasn't just about an unfair search. It was about a deeper, more systemic issue. But what lay behind it all? Who had a hand in it? The answers seemed just out of reach, and the diplomat knew he couldn't let it go until the full truth came to light. As days passed, the incident began to ripple through the community, raising uncomfortable questions about how people were treated based on the color of their skin. Neighbors, colleagues, and friends approached the diplomat, sharing similar stories, moments where they had felt watched, judged, or unfairly questioned by those in power. Each account deepened the diplomat's resolve, but it also sparked something else: fear. What if this wasn't an isolated event? What if others had faced similar treatment but hadn't spoken up? At the same time, whispers began to circulate among the officers. Rumors of tension within the precinct hinted at divisions, some officers feeling uneasy about the encounter, others defensive. Was there a shift happening within the force, or were certain individuals using their position to exert unchecked authority? The answers seemed elusive, hidden behind a wall of bureaucracy and procedural delays. Meanwhile, small clues began to surface: an anonymous letter here, a suspicious conversation there. Each piece added to the growing puzzle, but none of it felt substantial enough to crack the surface. The diplomat found himself questioning the sincerity of the apology. Was it truly a moment of reflection, or merely damage control? The tension in his chest grew as he realized that this wasn't just a fight for justice. It was part of a much larger battle, one that reached beyond the search of his children and into the fabric of society itself. And as the stakes rose, so did the danger lurking in the shadows. Those who didn't want the truth to come to light. Those who would go to great lengths to keep it buried. The climax hit like a thunderclap, shaking the very foundation of what everyone had believed to be true. Under the bright lights of the town hall, the diplomat stood at the center of the storm, surrounded by both allies and adversaries. With the former officer's revelation, a surge of courage had sparked within the crowd. Some had already begun to piece together the truth. The search wasn't random. It was deliberate, a calculated act meant to intimidate and control. But as the officers stormed in, intent on silencing the truth, something unexpected happened. A group of whistleblowers, officers who had quietly been working behind the scenes, stepped forward, risking everything to expose the deeper corruption. They revealed documents, intercepted orders, and records that proved the systematic targeting wasn't just confined to the diplomat's family. It stretched much further across the region. The truth cascaded down like a flood, dismantling the facade of order. The room erupted into chaos as conflicting sides clashed, officers scrambling to cover their tracks, while others fought to preserve justice. The diplomat, now fully understanding the web of deceit, seized the moment to call for action. He pleaded with the crowd to stay strong, to press for reform, not to let the fear of retaliation silence their voices. Just as it seemed like they might reach a tipping point, the final twist emerged. An anonymous figure, cloaked in shadows, stepped into view. It was someone no one had expected, someone powerful enough to have orchestrated it all from behind the scenes. The audience froze as the figure's identity was revealed, someone connected to both the political and police systems, someone who had been pulling strings for years. The realization hit hard. The entire incident had been a part of a much bigger plan, an attempt to maintain control over the region by sowing fear and division. As the diplomat stood face to face with this figure, the stakes reached a breaking point. But instead of a resolution, the figure offered one final challenge, a choice to walk away quietly or continue the fight, knowing full well the cost. The diplomat, along with the few who had stood by him, knew they couldn't back down. The crowd, emboldened by the truth, chose to rise up. In that moment, the tide began to shift. The system, flawed and corrupted, showed cracks, and the people found a newfound strength. Yet even as the crowd surged forward, the final twist remained. Justice may have been served, but the scars of what had transpired wouldn't fade easily. The diplomat's journey was far from over, and the truth had revealed just how deep the fight for equality truly went. In the days that followed, change began to ripple through the community. The once overlooked injustices slowly came to light, and the people who had once felt powerless found their voices. New policies were introduced, designed to hold those in power accountable, and the officers involved faced investigation and consequences. The diplomat and his family were no longer just witnesses to the events. They had become part of a larger movement, one that challenged long-standing systems of prejudice and corruption. Slowly, the fear that had once paralyzed the community began to fade, replaced by a sense of hope. But the journey wasn't over. Scars remained, both within the community and within the diplomat's family. Trust had to be rebuilt, relationships mended, and the fight for true equality continued. As for the figure responsible, once exposed, their power began to dwindle, and their influence faded into the background. Though the battle was far from complete, the seeds of change had been planted. It was a hard-fought victory, but one that carried the promise of a brighter future. The diplomat knew that this was just the beginning, and while justice had been served, the work ahead would demand constant vigilance. The events had shown them all the strength people could find when they stood together. As the final chapter closed, the diplomat reflected on the lessons learned, the value of perseverance, the power of truth, and the hope that lay in unity. And as the sun set on that day, a quiet determination burned within him, knowing that the fight for justice was far from over, but he wouldn't face it alone. The days leading up to the climax were filled with uncertainty and growing tension. The diplomat's every move felt scrutinized, as though unseen eyes were always watching. He began attending local town hall meetings, speaking out about what had happened, hoping to rally support. But with each passing gathering, the skepticism grew. Some believed his frustration was just an overreaction, while others wondered if there was more to his story, perhaps a political agenda behind his push for justice. The skepticism fed into the growing divide, and it became harder to separate genuine allies from those with hidden motives. Meanwhile, the officers, while outwardly quiet, seemed to be tightening their grip. Small, seemingly insignificant incidents began to pop up around the diplomat and his family. A mysterious vehicle appeared outside their home late at night, its occupants staying just long enough to raise suspicion before vanishing. Strange calls, odd messages from unknown numbers. Each small sign planted doubt and fear. The diplomat's gut told him someone was trying to intimidate them, to scare them into silence. And yet, despite these tactics, he pressed on, determined not to let fear dictate his actions. In the background, tensions between different groups in the community began to simmer, divisions that had once been dormant now bubbling to the surface. Long-standing prejudices, old alliances, and shifting loyalties began to take shape, adding more layers to the unfolding story. But no one seemed willing to speak openly, to expose the truth beneath the surface. And as the stakes grew higher, so did the danger. The diplomat knew that something big was about to happen, a moment where everything would either shift or explode. The question was who would stand by him when the time came, and who would choose to look the other way. Just when it seemed things couldn't get any more complicated, a shocking twist unraveled in the middle of a town meeting. As the diplomat stood before the crowd, recounting his experiences and calling for accountability, someone in the back of the room suddenly stood and interrupted him. It was a man, a former officer, someone who had once been a part of the precinct involved in the incident. His voice was steady, yet laced with bitterness, as he revealed something that took the air out of the room. "I wasn't supposed to speak up, but I can't stay silent anymore. That search wasn't just an accident. It was a directive, a message meant to send a clear signal." Gasps rippled through the crowd, disbelief flickering on everyone's faces. The man went on to explain how certain officers had been encouraged to treat certain people, diplomats, minority families, with suspicion, especially those they perceived as outsiders. It wasn't random, it was systematic. The diplomat's heart sank as the weight of the revelation hit him. The search wasn't just a mistake, it had been part of something much larger, something embedded within the system itself. But just as the information started to sink in, chaos erupted. A group of officers, once seemingly distant, suddenly flooded into the room, their faces tight with determination. They weren't there to restore order. They were there to silence the truth. Shouts and panic spread as the crowd was forced to scatter, leaving the diplomat isolated in the middle of the chaos. It became clear that this wasn't just about one family anymore. This was about exposing the truth, dismantling a much deeper network. The stakes had been raised, and now both sides were playing for something far greater than they realized.